Settle in and let your thoughts begin to drift. You're about to take a quiet journey into the distant past, a time when ceremony and tradition ruled daily life, when everything, even the joining of two hearts in marriage, carried layers of meaning, duty, and hardship. In this soft, winding tale, we'll step into the world of medieval weddings, a world far different from modern notions of love and celebration. You might imagine grand castles, flowing gowns, and joyous banquets, and some of that did exist. But beneath the surface, medieval weddings were rarely about romance. They were contracts, political arrangements, economic strategies, and sometimes the beginning of very difficult lives. Some weddings were marked by festivities, others were quiet, even sorrowful, and many were, by the standards of today, deeply unsettling. Tonight, we'll explore the customs, beliefs, and real stories behind those unions, from the cold logic of arranged matches to the ceremonial peculiarities that now seem almost unthinkable. We won't dwell on the shocking or the gruesome. Instead, we'll move gently through history, like walking through a foggy village street, letting the past quietly reveal itself. So close your eyes if you wish, and imagine yourself in another time. Imagine yourself waking up in a small thatched cottage somewhere in 13th century England. The air is cool, and the light filters through thin wooden shutters. You lie on a straw-stuffed mattress beside the hearth, and the distant sounds of livestock stir in the morning haze. You're perhaps 10 or 12 years old, and though today you may still feel like a child, the village priest and your parents have already begun to speak in hushed tones about your future. Not your career, not your passions, but your marriage. In the medieval world, the concept of childhood as we know it didn't really exist. Most peasants worked from the moment they could lift a tool or carry a pail. And marriage? For many girls, it could be expected by 12 or 13. Boys often married later, when they could support a household, perhaps at 16 or 18. In noble families, betrothals could happen even earlier, some before a child could walk or talk. It wasn't uncommon for two families to agree upon a union while their children were still in cradles. These early arrangements were not legally binding at birth, but the social pressure to follow through was immense. A family's reputation, land holdings, and political alliances might depend on it. For the average villager, marriage was more pragmatic than passionate. A husband needed a wife to cook, tend animals, and bear children. A wife needed a husband to provide protection and a stable roof. It was not considered unusual for young girls to be married off to much older men. In some communities, this was viewed not with concern but with approval. A man of property could offer stability. That was what mattered. The church, ever present in medieval life, offered a few guidelines. The legal minimum age for marriage was 12 for girls and 14 for boys. But this referred only to the possibility of marriage, not necessarily its consummation, though that line was often blurred and rarely enforced. Consent was technically required, but a nod or silence could suffice. Formal ceremonies were not strictly necessary either. A mutual declaration, witnessed by others, could constitute a valid union. You might imagine a young girl, barely past her first years of menstruation, kneeling before a priest beside a man twice her age. She may not fully grasp the change unfolding. Her childhood, such as it was, would vanish that day. And still, life carried on around her. In the background of these unions were fields to till, bread to bake, and livestock to tend. No time for dreams, no space for fairy tales. Just the weight of duty, and a future shaped by others' decisions. Even the wedding day itself, if celebrated at all, was rarely centered on the bride. In many villages, a couple might simply walk together to the church and have their union blessed after Mass. Their garments were ordinary, gifts were modest. There might be a communal meal, with ale and bread passed around. Sometimes there was no feast at all. Among the nobility, however, weddings were another matter, lavish, strategic, and sometimes shockingly impersonal. But we'll wander there in a little while. In this moment, picture instead a small village lane. Two figures walk silently, their hands not yet clasped, their eyes uncertain. A few neighbors gather to watch. The church bell tolls softly in the distance. There is no music, no laughter, just the sound of footfalls on packed earth and the rustle of a woolen veil in the wind. Marriage, in the Middle Ages, was not the start of a love story. It was the continuation of survival, a solemn step on a long, hard path. And yet, within this framework of obligation and routine, some found comfort. They raised children together. They endured famine and plague side by side. They built small joys from harsh days. That quiet rhythm, that slow dance of daily medieval life, forms the soil from which these ancient wedding customs grew. And now, as we leave this village behind, the wind carries us toward a castle where wedding bells sound not for love, but for alliance. Now, let the haze shift around you. Imagine the soft echo of footsteps on stone floors, and the muffled hush of servants moving through long corridors, lit by flickering torches. You are no longer in a peasant's cottage. This is a noble household, perhaps a manor nestled on the edge of a great forest, or a cold grey castle rising above the moors. Here, the air carries different concerns, not firewood or barley, but lineage, inheritance and power. In the medieval world, noble marriages were rarely unions of affection. They were chess moves in an endless game of alliances, crafted to secure borders, wealth, or peace between rival houses. A single marriage could redraw territorial maps, merge ancestral claims, or secure the favor of a powerful monarch. These arrangements were handled not by the young bride or groom, but by their elders, sometimes years in advance. Picture a girl of 8 or 9, daughter to a minor baron. Her father receives a letter, a proposal from a distant earl, offering his son in marriage. The terms are favorable. Lands will be exchanged. A dowry will be paid. Promises will be sealed. Before the girl even begins to understand what it means to marry, she may be sent away, perhaps to the household of her future in-laws. There, she will be raised under their roof, molded into the wife they expect her to become. These arrangements, known as fosterage, were common. They ensured the young bride would be properly trained in etiquette, religious practice, and household management. She might not see her own parents again for years. The groom, often a boy himself, had little more say. He too bore the weight of family ambition. His education was shaped by the expectation that he would inherit titles and responsibilities, and that one day he would wed this girl, a stranger-turned-wife, whom he barely knew. The actual wedding ceremony, when it came, was sometimes lavish, sometimes modest, depending on circumstances. But it always had one purpose: to make public the binding of two houses. Imagine the great hall draped in banners. Tables are set with trenchers of bread, platters of roasted fowl, and pitchers of mead. Musicians strum lutes or pluck harp strings, and guests murmur beneath the echoing rafters. At the center of it all stands the couple, likely adolescents, perhaps even children. They are dressed in fine linens and embroidered silks, their faces carefully composed. Behind them, rows of nobles bear witness. A priest lifts his hand, blesses the union, and invokes God's favor. What follows, however, is not a simple celebration. In many regions and periods, the newlyweds were led sometimes by an entire procession to the bedchamber. This ritual, known as the bedding ceremony, was one of the more jarring aspects of medieval weddings. Its nature varied widely. In some places, it was symbolic. Guests might escort the couple with torches and good wishes, then depart. In other settings, it could be invasive and unsettling, with onlookers remaining until the bedclothes had been drawn, or even tossing the bride and groom into bed while reciting bawdy songs. Though it may seem intrusive now, the purpose was rooted in legality and legitimacy. Witnesses ensured that the marriage was consummated, thereby finalizing the bond. For noble families, this was essential. Inheritance depended on the legitimacy of heirs. The bride, often still a child, might not even fully understand what was expected of her, yet the pressures were immense. A failure to produce offspring especially was grounds for public scrutiny and private despair. Infertility was almost always blamed on the woman, regardless of cause. Remedies ranged from prayer to herbal concoctions to, in some cases, harsh penance. And what of love? It might come later, or not at all. Some couples grew fond of one another, sharing quiet companionship in the long years of adulthood. Others remained strangers in a shared fortress, their bond more legal than personal. Still, life in the castle was not constant ceremony. Once married, a noblewoman became mistress of the household, supervising servants, managing stores, and overseeing the education of children. She might also be called upon to act as regent, should her husband be away at war or court. Her days were structured, demanding, and often lonely. From a modern perspective, these weddings seem harsh, devoid of choice, full of pressure, and shaped by forces beyond any young person's control. But within their time, they were seen as necessary. The world was fragile. Family honor, land holdings, and stability depended on carefully forged unions. Even joy, when it came, was restrained. A wedding might be followed by days of feasting, yet beneath the surface was always the silent knowledge that this was more than a celebration. It was a transaction, a treaty, a binding oath. Now, imagine that great hall, again candles guttering low, guests dispersing, musicians packing their instruments. The fire crackles in the hearth. Somewhere behind a wooden door, the newlyweds begin their lives together, not as lovers, but as players in a centuries-old ritual of alliance and inheritance. As the embers fade, so too do the sounds of the feast. All that remains is the hush of stone corridors and the slow turning of time. Let the scene change once more. We drift now to the heart of ceremony, not just the grand spectacle of noble weddings or the quiet murmur of village unions, but the curious, sometimes puzzling customs that marked these occasions across medieval Europe. From the British Isles to the forests of Eastern Europe, weddings were not merely personal affairs. They were public events, rich with symbolism, community involvement, and deeply rooted beliefs, some ancient, others emerging with the spread of Christianity. Imagine yourself standing in a small stone church nestled in the countryside. Ivy crawls up its walls, and the scent of damp moss mixes with candle wax inside. A crowd gathers, villagers pressing in close. The priest prepares his book, while a nervous couple stands before the altar. But before vows are spoken or blessings bestowed, certain rituals must be observed, rituals that now seem unusual or even unsettling to modern sensibilities. One such tradition involved the banns of marriage. For 3 Sundays before a couple was to marry, their names were read aloud during Mass, giving the community time to raise any objections. This wasn't merely a quaint formality, it was vital. If anyone knew of a reason the marriage should not proceed, such as a pre-existing betrothal or a forbidden degree of kinship, they were expected to speak up. Failing to do so could taint the legitimacy of the marriage, and by extension, any future children. Then there were the tokens exchanged, not just rings but belts, knives, even pieces of clothing. In many areas, a groom might give his bride a coin or a shoe as a symbolic gesture of ownership and protection. These gifts carried legal weight, signaling consent and finality. And there were peculiar gestures, like the hand-fasting ritual found in parts of Britain and Scandinavia. In this custom, the couple's hands were bound together, sometimes for a symbolic hour, sometimes for a full year, signifying a trial period of sorts. Though popularized in romantic tales today, handfasting was often a legal step toward eventual full marriage, especially in regions where formal clergy were not always available. In some towns, a bride might be paraded through the streets after the ceremony, not with flowers and music, but with jeering laughter and coarse humor. This was not meant to insult her, but to acknowledge the serious transition she was undergoing from girlhood to womanhood, from her father's house to her husband's. Communities believed that raucous noise could ward off evil spirits, who were thought to be especially attracted to the vulnerability of brides. Even more unusual were fertility rituals. In some rural areas, guests would scatter grain at the bride's feet, or place symbols of abundance fruit, bread, or even animal bones near her as omens of a fruitful union. There are records of brides being led around the hearth 3 times before entering the marital bed, or of newlyweds jumping over broomsticks, antlers, or even fire pits as a symbolic severing from childhood. And then there were the shoes. It may sound odd, but shoes played a surprisingly important role in medieval weddings. In some regions, the father of the bride would strike the groom on the head with a shoe lightly, symbolically to represent the transfer of authority. In others, guests would throw old shoes at the couple, or nail them above the bedroom door to bring luck and ensure fidelity. The rituals did not end once the wedding was done. For days afterward, the community might monitor the couple closely. Neighbors might ask probing questions. In some areas, a small child was placed in the newlyweds' bed to bless their fertility. If no child was born within a year, whispers might begin to spread. Superstitions ran deep, but not all customs were heavy or dark. Some were charming in their simplicity. In Brittany, couples planted trees together after their vows apple, hazel, or ash meant to grow alongside their marriage. In parts of Italy, brides braided wildflowers into their hair and wore wreaths made of rosemary, a symbol of memory and constancy. You begin to notice a pattern. Beneath the surface oddity of these rituals lies a deep concern with transition, protection, and community. In an age where life was short and uncertain, marriages were milestones that mattered not just to the couple, but to everyone around them. They were cause for both celebration and solemnity. Now, imagine the end of a long wedding day in a village on the edge of winter. The sun sets behind the hills. The last scraps of meat have been eaten. The ale is nearly gone. A tired bride unties the knots in her braided hair. The groom removes his wedding tunic, the one borrowed from his uncle. Outside, the guests begin to drift away, singing, laughing, clutching cloaks against the cold. Inside, only the crackle of fire remains. The strange rituals of the day fade into memory, their meanings carried quietly into the years ahead. Let the flickering candlelight guide you now into the solemn heart of medieval belief, the church. To truly understand why medieval weddings could be so rigid, so ritual-laden, and at times even harsh, one must understand the immense influence the church held over every corner of daily life. Marriage, above all, was not just a social contract, it was a sacred sacrament. Picture the cold interior of a Romanesque church. Stone arches rise overhead like frozen waves, echoing the distant chants of monks. Light filters through stained glass windows, casting hues of crimson and sapphire across the worn flagstones. And in the center, before the altar, a priest in linen robes prepares to unite 2 souls not only in law, but in the eyes of God. By the 12th century, the church had begun to claim exclusive authority over the institution of marriage. Before that, marriage was largely a private affair, arranged by families, sealed with handshakes and oaths. But as Christianity expanded its influence, church leaders began to see marriage as a way to regulate morality and protect spiritual purity. And so, ceremonies grew more elaborate, canon law evolved. Only unions officiated or at least blessed by the church were considered truly valid. The presence of a priest became increasingly necessary. And more importantly, the doctrine of indissolubility was emphasized once married. A couple could not divorce. They were bound in life and in death. This idea brought both sanctity and suffering. If a marriage was unhappy, abusive or barren, there were few recourses. Annulment was possible but rare, and often granted only to the wealthy or powerful. For most, even a loveless union was a lifelong one. In this way, the church both elevated and confined the married state. It was holy, yes, but also inescapable. The church also imposed strict rules on who could marry whom. Consanguinity laws prohibited unions between blood relatives up to the seventh degree in entanglement, so complex that many couples had to seek special dispensations just to proceed. These rules served to prevent inbreeding, but also gave the church greater control. Only clergy could interpret these charts of lineage. Even the timing of weddings was governed by religious rhythms. Marriages were discouraged during Lent and Advent, or on feast days. Some months like May, associated with pagan fertility rites, were frowned upon entirely. Couples who married at the wrong time risked social disapproval or ecclesiastical penalties. And yet, the church did not strip marriage of emotion entirely. In fact, by the late Middle Ages, there emerged an emphasis on mutual consent. Both bride and groom were expected to affirm their willingness, even if arranged by their families. This concept, though limited in practice, laid early groundwork for the later idea of romantic marriage. Still, the wedding ceremony itself remained focused not on love, but on duty. The priest would speak of obedience, of the bearing of children, and of the trials that awaited. He might remind the couple that their union reflected the bond between Christ and the church sacred, enduring, and, above all, unbreakable. Afterward, the newlyweds would kneel before the altar, receive communion, and be anointed with holy water. Their names might be entered in parish records, joining the long litany of unions stretching back through generations. Bells might toll, and then, quietly, the couple would begin their life together, returning home not just as man and wife, but as living participants in a divine order. Yet, for all its seriousness, the church could not entirely suppress older, folk beliefs. In many places, local customs persisted alongside Christian rites. Pagan symbols were repurposed. Ancient fertility charms were woven into the hems of wedding garments. Saints replaced spirits, but the desire for protection, for blessings, for healthy offspring, those desires remained unchanged. Now, imagine standing at the back of that church, long after the ceremony has ended. The guests are gone, the candles sputter, and in the silence, the air feels thick with centuries of whispered prayers and spoken vows. Here, in these sacred walls, generations came to be joined, not always by love, but by faith and fear, and the unyielding belief that life's greatest transformations should unfold beneath the gaze of heaven. And as the door creaks shut behind you, we turn now to a very different aspect of medieval marriage, what it meant to women. Now let your thoughts follow the thread of a young woman's life in the medieval world. With the wedding ceremony behind her, her journey has only just begun. In many ways, the marriage was not a culmination, but a quiet beginning, a transition from girlhood to a new role filled with expectation, uncertainty, and often hardship. In a society built on hierarchy and custom, women were rarely the architects of their own lives. Their place, from childhood onward, was prepared for marriage. Their education, if any, focused on managing a household, obeying authority, and bearing children. Even noble women, born to wealth and influence, were expected to serve as political vessels and loyal caretakers, their personal desires muted by duty. Imagine a young bride, perhaps 14 or 15 years old, sitting by the hearth on her first night in a new home. The garments she wore on her wedding day are neatly folded beside her. The weight of her veil still lingers on her shoulders, though it has been removed. Around her, everything is unfamiliar. The smell of the walls, the creak of the stairs, even the voices of servants now bound to her husband's family. She may not yet know how to manage a household or discipline a maid. She likely does not yet understand the expectations of intimacy. And yet, those responsibilities fall on her all at once. In rural life, her daily burdens are physical. She must rise early to bake bread, fetch water, feed animals, spin wool. Marriage does not spare her from toil, it adds to it. She is now expected to nourish a family, to produce heirs, and to carry the labor of generations forward. In noble homes, the tasks are different but no less demanding. She may supervise dozens of servants, manage inventories of linens and grain, oversee the accounts of estates, and arrange the marriages of younger siblings or retainers. She might be responsible for defending the estate in her husband's absence, not uncommon occurrence, as many men were away on crusades, at court, or in battle for long stretches of time. Above all, the medieval bride was expected to bear children, and in this, perhaps more than any other realm, she was vulnerable. Childbirth was dangerous. The tools of midwifery were crude, the understanding of infection minimal, and the toll on a young body immense. It was not uncommon for women to die giving birth to their first child. Many who survived would go on to have 5, 10, or more. Each pregnancy brought risk, and each child lost brought grief. And yet, there was little space for mourning. A noble woman might return to her duties within days of delivery. A peasant woman might rise from the birthing straw and return to the fields the same week. Women had few legal protections. Once married, their property, if any typically transferred to their husbands, their rights to annulment or separation were limited. Abuse, abandonment, and neglect were not easily addressed by courts, and the church's support often leaned toward preserving the marriage at all costs, rather than safeguarding the woman within it. Yet within these strictures, women found ways to wield influence. A skilled wife could manage a household with quiet command. Some became respected healers, advisors, or matriarchs. In convents, women found refuge, community, and education, sometimes even independence. There were exceptions too. Noble women who ruled in their husband's absence, queens who negotiated treaties, abbesses who directed powerful religious orders. But these were rare, and even their power was often framed within the language of male approval and divine permission. For most women, the wedding day was not a beginning of choice, but of submission to a life largely dictated by others. It was a crossing over a farewell to youth, to home, to autonomy. And yet, through small rituals and quiet resilience, many women shaped their families and communities in profound ways. They passed down stories, traditions, and remedies. They stood at the center of village life, even when history did not record their names. They were the stewards of continuity. Now picture that same bride, years later. Her hands are worn, her eyes lined with years of care. Around her gather children and grandchildren. She sits in the same home that once felt so unfamiliar. Her life has been filled with challenge, but also with moments of warmth, soft blankets spun from flax, bread baked on cold mornings, songs hummed while rocking a cradle. The burden of marriage was heavy, but it was carried, often without complaint, by generations of women whose quiet endurance shaped the fabric of medieval life. And as we leave her now, we move toward another part of the story, what happened when love entered the picture, unexpectedly. Let your thoughts now wander beyond the stone walls of castles and cottages, into gardens, courtyards, and whispered hallways. Though most marriages in the medieval world were built on duty and arrangement, not all hearts conformed. There was another realm subtle, shadowed, and often idealized where love unfolded outside the bounds of wedlock. This was the world of courtly love. Imagine a noble court in southern France in the 12th century. The air is filled with the scent of lavender and rosemary. A bard sings softly in a corner, and the rustle of silk dresses accompanies the low murmur of conversation. Among the audience are knights and ladies, poets and priests, and perhaps somewhere in the corner of the room, two glances meet and linger. Courtly love was not marriage. In fact, it flourished because marriage was so often a formality, a political or economic necessity, not a romance. Courtly love existed beside marriage as an emotional outlet, an artistic ideal, and sometimes a dangerous temptation. The concept was born among the troubadour-spout musicians of the High Middle Ages. Their songs and stories praised the beauty, virtue, and unattainability of noble women, often married, whom knights served with chaste devotion. In this world, love was both suffering and exaltation, A knight might spend years proving his worth to a lady, never expecting physical consummation, only her smile, her favour, or perhaps a single glove tied to his lance. But the lines between fiction and reality were often blurred. Some lords and ladies engaged in secret liaisons, protected by wealth and status. Others found themselves in genuine affection, though constrained by the marriages they had been born into. Love became a silent rebellion, expressed in verse, glances, and gestures. The church frowned on these arrangements, of course. Adultery was a sin, and desire outside the marital bed was condemned. But courtly love was framed as spiritual, elevated closer to a knight's love for the Virgin Mary than to lust. In this way, it found space to exist, at least in story. Consider the story of Abelard and Heloisia, real, tragic tale from 12th century France. He, a scholar and theologian, she, a brilliant young woman under his tutelage. Their affair began in secret, defying the expectations of their roles. When discovered, the consequences were harsh. Abelard was attacked and maimed. Heloise was sent to a convent. Yet their letters, exchanged over years, reveal a bond not extinguished by distance or fate. Their love, though never fulfilled in marriage, echoes through history. Even among common folk, love sometimes took root in unlikely places. There are records of couples defying their parents' wishes to marry for affection, eloping to avoid arranged matches, or living together outside of wedlock. Such actions were risky. They could lead to social exile, loss of dowry, or public penance. Yet they happened nonetheless, because even in a world of harsh obligation, human hearts still longed for connection. Love could also bloom within marriages slowly, over time. A union arranged in childhood might, through shared labour, hardship, and companionship, become something deeper. These stories were quieter, less recorded, but no less real. They were written not in poems or songs, but in the routines of daily life, fetching water together, nursing a sick child, preparing meals side by side. Still, for many, love remained a distant ideal, especially for women, who were rarely permitted to choose their partner and whose virtue was tightly guarded. A single misstep could destroy a reputation. A noblewoman caught in adultery risked not only disgrace, but confinement, exile, or death. Even rumours could be dangerous. But that did not stop the songs. Ballads were passed from village to village, telling of tragic lovers, noble knights, and the pain of yearning. In dark winter halls, travellers shared tales of unconsummated desire and secret vows. And so, love persisted not in grand declarations, but in careful looks, coded language, and moments stolen from the rigid machinery of duty. It was the quiet thread woven through the loud fabric of feasts and ceremonies. It was a candle burning low in a shuttered room, its light flickering just out of reach. As you lie here now, far from that world of cloistered gardens and stony chapels, you might consider the strange balance of the medieval heart, bound by rules, yet drawn toward feeling, tied to duty, yet still dreaming. And as the candlelight fades, we'll soon explore the final piece of this story, when marriage did not happen at all, and what that meant for those left on the edges. Let the silence settle now, and imagine a path not taken. Not every medieval man or woman walked down the aisle, knelt at an altar, or exchanged rings and vows. Some, by choice or by fate, remained outside the structure of marriage, and in doing so, found themselves inhabiting a very different place in society. In the medieval world, to remain unmarried was not simply a personal decision. It was a deviation from the expected rhythm of life. Marriage was more than a private matter. It was a social contract, a symbol of adulthood, a contribution to the order of things. To step outside that path was to live on the margins. For women especially, remaining unwed could be a sentence of hardship, a quiet form of liberation. Picture a young woman of 25, far past the usual age of marriage. Her family is poor, and no dowry could be offered on her behalf. Suitors did not come. Over time, the community begins to see her differently. She is no longer just a daughter or sister. She becomes the spinster, a label tinged with suspicion. In towns and villages, such women were often relegated to menial work laundresses, ale brewers, midwives, or caretakers. Some lived under the roof of relatives, contributing labour in exchange for shelter. Others lived alone, which was rarer, and marked them as peculiar. In times of plague or misfortune, such women could be accused of witchcraft or blamed for illness and crop failure. Isolation bred rumour. And yet, there was also a quiet resilience in their lives. Some found independence in solitude, able to manage small shops, grow herbs, or act as healers and caretakers in ways married women could not. Unburdened by children or husbands, they sometimes had more freedom of movement, though rarely freedom from judgment. For noble women, remaining unmarried could be more strategic. Daughters not chosen for marriage might be sent to convents. Though it may seem a confinement, many found peace and purpose there. Life in a convent offered literacy, community, and even a form of authority. Abbesses could wield significant influence, managing landholdings and overseeing the welfare of dozens of women. The cloister was a place where the unwed were not only accepted, but honoured. Men who did not marry also lived under a watchful gaze. In rural areas, bachelors beyond their 20s were regarded with suspicion. Were they lazy? Untrustworthy? Why had no family taken them? Some became journeymen or monks. Others took seasonal work or wandered from village to village, never settling down. A few sought holy orders, not always out of devotion, but because the path of celibacy provided shelter and status. But not all remained celibate. There were couples who lived together without marriage common law unions. In some regions, such arrangements were tolerated, especially if the couple eventually wed, or if their partnership was stable and public. The church disapproved, but local customs were often more flexible. Still, children born outside of marriage bore a heavy burden. They were labelled illegitimate, a term that carried both social and legal consequences. They could not inherit titles or property, and often faced discrimination. Yet these children were part of village life, all the samarized by extended families, apprenticed to trades, or taken in by monastic institutions. Society worked hard to organize itself into predictable forms. Marriage was one of its key foundations. Those who stood outside that structure, whether by circumstance, resistance, or quiet defiance, were seen as unsettling, but they also revealed something enduring, that not all lives followed the same script. Now imagine one such woman, older now, living at the edge of a village. Her house is small, her hearth modest, yet she tends a garden of herbs, cares for neighbour children, and speaks softly to those in grief. She was never a bride, never a wife, but she has lived a full life on, not marked by wedding bells, but by small acts of service and endurance. In every era, there are those who dwell at the edges, and while medieval society may have frowned upon them, history often forgets that it was these very people, quiet, unseen, who held many communities together. As we leave them now, we come to the last thread in this tapestry of medieval marriage. What happened when things fell apart, when the vows were broken, or never fully kept? Now, we come to the edges of a sacred bond, not at its beginning, but at its unraveling. In a time when marriage was seen as permanent, bound by law and heaven alike, what happened when the union frayed? When affection vanished? When cruelty grew? Or when silence stretched between two people in a long grey stillness? The medieval world had few provisions for the broken marriage. Divorce, as we understand it today, was essentially impossible in Christian Europe. The Church viewed marriage as indissolubly a sacrament no human hand could undo. Even if a couple separated, they remained, in the eyes of both Church and community, husband and wife until death. And yet, marriages did fail, quietly, awkwardly, and often painfully. Imagine a couple in a small village married young, as most were. Perhaps their marriage was arranged between families with hopes of merging lands or settling debts. Over the years, the bond between them cools. There are no children, or perhaps too many. Quarrels grow, not with shouting but with absence. One begins to sleep near the hearth. The other disappears into fields or taverns until long past nightfall. There is no legal ending, only endurance. In the upper classes, separation was sometimes formalized. A wife might be sent to a family estate or cloistered in a convent. A husband might provide a small allowance and continue his life elsewhere. These arrangements were not ideal, but they allowed noble families to save face. Annulment was another possibility, though rare, and often wrapped in politics. For an annulment to be granted, the couple needed to prove that the marriage was invalid from the start, perhaps due to consanguinity, lack of consent, impotence, or a prior betrothal. These cases required the approval of a bishop, or sometimes the Pope himself. The process could take years, filled with testimony, examinations, and shame. Among common folk, abandonment was more common than annulment. A man might simply leave, vanish into another village, perhaps even remarry under a false name. A woman might do the same, though her risks were greater. If caught, she could be branded an adulteress, face public humiliation, or be denied support from her former husband's family. Adultery, though widely condemned, was not always punished equally. A man's infidelity was often overlooked, particularly if it involved a servant or prostitute. A woman's, however, could result in severe consequences. She might be shaved, locked away, forced into penance, or even publicly flogged in some regions. The church tried to intervene in failing marriages, not to end them, but to preserve them. Priests acted as mediators, encouraging forgiveness, penance, and prayer. Husbands were reminded of their duty to protect. Wives, their duty to obey. The language of reconciliation was rooted in obligation, not fulfillment. And yet, within these constraints, people adapted. Some couples lived together as quiet strangers. Others maintained public civility while seeking comfort elsewhere. A few found ways to renegotiate their lives-dividing labor, sleeping separately, avoiding confrontation. Not resolution, but survival. There were rare moments of rebellion. Women who ran away from abusive husbands. Men who refused to support wives they believed unfaithful. These acts were risky, but they did occur, and when they did, they often left a trail in local court records, preserved for centuries as glimpses of private lives pushed into public judgment. You might imagine one such record, written in a slow, careful Latin hand. Johannes, son of Thomas, accuses his wife, Agnes, of abandoning her duties. She was seen in the house of a cooper. She has not returned these 7 weeks. The words are spare, but behind them lies a world of sorrow, anger, and unmet expectation. Still, for all the failed unions, many endured not because they were ideal, but because they were inevitable. In a world without escape, people learned to live within the limits of their bonds. Some found moments of peace, others only a long resignation. Now picture an elderly couple seated on a wooden bench, watching the sun sink behind distant hills. They do not speak. Their hands are folded. They've shared a roof for 40 years. They have survived harvests, illness, births, and losses. The tenderness once hoped for may have never fully bloomed, and yet they sit together still 2 lives, bound by time more than affection. Their story is not romantic, but it is real, and in that reality lies a quiet dignity. And now, as this tale comes to a close, we return to where we began, not in celebration, but in reflection. Let us now gently step into the final moments of this journey. Now, let the path grow quiet beneath your feet. The dust of centuries settles, and the sound of bells, once ringing in wedding chapels or echoing across manor fields, fades into a soft hush. We have walked a long road tonight through small villages and high stone halls, across rituals, burdens, and the fragile hopes that tied people together in one of life's oldest institutions. Marriage in the medieval world was not what we might wish it to have been. It was not the flowering of affection, nor the freedom to choose, nor even a shelter from the hardships of life. Instead, it was a structure rigid, often harsh, yet essential to the social order of its time. We have seen young brides married before they knew the shape of their own futures, husbands chosen not for love, but for land, loyalty, or legacy. We have seen the customs that shaped their weddings, the binding of hands, the scattering of grain, the public bedding rituals so alien to us now. We have seen the immense role of the church, sanctifying unions, while making them all but unbreakable. And yet, within this structure, there were moments of softness. A wife placing bread beside her husband before dawn, a shared glance at a table, after years of living side by side, a bride's nervous smile before stepping into the church, the laughter of guests tossing shoes, a tree planted for luck, a candle lit in silence. Marriage, then as now, was both a private act and a public expectation. It could lift people up, bind them down. It could offer companionship or become a quiet sorrow borne for decades. And those who stepped outside of it, the unwed, the abandoned, the rebels and the cloistered, were both feared and needed, dismissed and relied upon. If you listen closely now, you can almost hear the rustle of wedding veils in the wind, the distant call of a church bell on a cold morning, the soft sob of a girl too young to understand her vows, the quiet strength of a woman shaping her world without recognition, the hum of a troubadour's song, mournful and slow, floating across a courtyard at dusk. These were not the weddings of fairy tales. They were not adorned in roses and gentle violins, but they were real, lived, endured, and remembered in fragment stone inscriptions, faded letters, and the enduring pulse of human experience. And as you rest now, far from that distant world of lords and serfs, priests and poets, let your thoughts drift freely. You are here, in the present, where love is more freely chosen, where vows are not prison doors, and where the past exists only in quiet stories told by candlelight. May those stories guide you into stillness, into sleep, into peace,